When you look back at the final stretch of the Second World War in the Pacific Theatre, you come across one of those weapons that has been mythologized beyond all recognition. The kamikaze pilots of Imperial Japan have been turned into something almost supernatural by movies and television shows and popular culture generally. People imagine these attacks as unstoppable forces of nature, these young men diving from the sky like avenging angels, their planes loaded with explosives, crashing into American warships with devastating precision. The imagery is powerful, almost romantic in a dark way, and it has stuck in the cultural consciousness for decades now. But here is the thing that nobody really talks about, the thing that gets left out of all those dramatic reenactments and historical documentaries that focus on the spectacular nature of the attacks themselves. The actual effectiveness of these suicide missions was astonishingly low. We are talking about a failure rate that would be almost comical if it were not so tragic. Let me walk you through what actually happened, because the numbers tell a story that is completely at odds with the legend. The Japanese military began organizing these kamikaze operations in a systematic way during the autumn of 1944. This was happening right around the time of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which was itself a catastrophic defeat for the Imperial Japanese Navy. By this point in the war, Japan was in a desperate situation. Their naval power had been systematically dismantled over the previous 3 years of fighting. The once formidable carrier fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor was now at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Their experienced pilots, the ones who had trained for years before the war and had honed their skills in combat over China and in the early Pacific campaigns, were almost all dead. The fuel situation was beyond critical. Oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies were being sunk by American submarines faster than they could be replaced. The training pipeline for new pilots had collapsed. Everything was falling apart. So somebody in the Japanese High Command looked at this situation and came up with what seemed like a brilliant solution on paper. If you cannot train pilots to fight effectively in conventional air combat, if you do not have the fuel for extended operations, if your planes are becoming obsolete and your industrial capacity cannot keep up with American production, then why not turn every single aircraft into a guided missile? Take a Zero fighter, which was already outdated by 1944, load it up with about 500 pounds of high explosives, and send it diving straight into an American warship at something like 400 miles per hour. The kinetic energy alone from that kind of impact, combined with the explosion of all that ordnance and the ignition of the aircraft fuel, should theoretically be enough to rip a destroyer completely apart. A single pilot, one plane, one ship. The mathematics seemed to work out. Japan had plenty of young men who could be taught the absolute basics of flying in just a few weeks. They did not need to learn air combat tactics or navigation for long-range missions or anything complicated. Just take off, fly to the target area, find a ship, and dive into it. The propaganda machine went into overdrive selling this concept. They called it the kamikaze, which translates to divine wind, a reference to the typhoons that had destroyed Mongol invasion fleets centuries earlier and saved Japan from conquest. The implication was clear. These young pilots would be a supernatural force, an act of the gods themselves, that would turn back the American invasion just as the storms had turned back the Mongols. Young men, many of them still teenagers, some barely old enough to shave, were told that they would become heroes for eternity. Their sacrifice would save the homeland. Their deaths would have meaning and purpose. The emperor himself would honor their memory. It was incredibly effective propaganda, at least in terms of getting volunteers and conscripts to accept their fate. But propaganda and reality are two very different things, and the reality of the kamikaze program was absolutely brutal in ways that the Japanese leadership either did not anticipate or chose to ignore. Let me give you the overall statistics first, because they are genuinely shocking when you see them laid out. Over the course of the war, approximately 3,800 Japanese pilots died in kamikaze operations. That is 3,800 young men who climbed into aircraft knowing they were never coming back, who said goodbye to their families for the last time. who wrote final letters that would be delivered after their deaths. 3,800 individual human tragedies. And what did those deaths accomplish? They managed to damage or sink around 400 Allied ships. They killed approximately 4,900 Allied sailors. Now, on the surface, those numbers might sound significant. 400 ships damaged or sunk sounds like a lot. 4,900 casualties is certainly nothing to dismiss. But you have to put this in context. The United States Navy, by 1945, had over 1,200 major warships in service. That is just the major vessels, battleships and carriers and cruisers and destroyers. When you add in all the smaller ships, the destroyer escorts and patrol boats and landing craft and support vessels and everything else, you are talking about thousands upon thousands of ships. Less than 4% of the American fleet was put out of action by kamikaze attacks. 4%. After 3,800 suicide missions. The trade ratio was catastrophic for Japan. For every kamikaze pilot who died, barely more than one Allied sailor was killed. Think about that for a moment. You are trading one life for one life, except you are the side that is already outnumbered and outproduced and running out of manpower. The arithmetic makes no sense whatsoever. The first major problem with the whole kamikaze concept was the quality of the pilots themselves. Early in the war, Japanese naval aviation was genuinely world-class. The pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor and who fought in the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway were among the best-trained aviators on the planet. They had thousands of hours of flight time. They had practiced their skills over China. They knew their aircraft inside and out. They could execute complex maneuvers under combat conditions. But by 1944, those men were gone. 3 years of brutal attrition had killed almost all of them. The replacements were a completely different story. These new pilots were getting maybe a few weeks of flight training, sometimes less. Many of them could barely take off and land safely, let alone navigate across open ocean or handle their aircraft in combat conditions. Some of them had never even seen the ocean before they were sent out to die over it. American radar technology meant that these inexperienced pilots were being tracked from dozens of miles away. The US Navy knew they were coming long before they arrived. Combat air patrols of Hellcats and Corsairs would intercept them while they were still far from the fleet. American pilots, who had hundreds of hours of training and actual combat experience, would tear into these kamikaze formations like wolves among sheep. There are accounts from American fighter pilots describing how they would shoot down entire groups of kamikazes in a matter of minutes. The Japanese pilots simply did not have the skills to evade or fight back. They would fly in straight lines, easy targets, and get picked off one after another. Even if a kamikaze somehow made it past the combat air patrol, they then had to face the anti-aircraft defenses of the fleet itself, and by 1945 those defenses were absolutely murderous. American warships bristled with anti-aircraft guns of every caliber. You had the 5-inch dual-purpose guns that could engage targets at long range. You had the 40mm Bofors guns that put up a curtain of fire at medium range. You had the 20mm Oerlikon cannons for close-in defense. And the really devastating innovation was the proximity-fused shell. These were artillery shells that did not need to directly hit a target. They had a tiny radar built into them that would detect when they were near an aircraft and would detonate automatically. Suddenly you did not need a direct hit to shoot down a plane. You just needed to get close. The explosion would shred the aircraft with shrapnel. All of this firepower was directed by radar and coordinated fire control systems. American gunners could track targets they could not even see with the naked eye and put shells exactly where they needed to be. The volume of fire was incredible. During the Battle of Okinawa, which was the largest single deployment of kamikaze forces in the war, American ships fired nearly 500,000 anti-aircraft shells at incoming kamikazes. 500,000 rounds. The sky would be filled with explosions and tracers and shrapnel. US sailors described it as a wall of steel that nothing could penetrate. And they were mostly right. Only a tiny fraction of kamikazes actually made it through that defensive gauntlet. Here is a statistic that really drives home how ineffective these attacks were. At Okinawa, the Japanese launched 1,900 kamikaze sorties. That is 1,900 individual suicide missions, 1,900 pilots who took off knowing they would never return. Of those 1,900 attacks, fewer than 15% actually hit a ship. Fewer than 15%. That means more than 1,600 pilots died without accomplishing anything at all. They crashed into the ocean, or were shot down miles from their targets, or their planes malfunctioned, or they got lost. 1,600 lives wasted for absolutely nothing. Think about what that represents. Each one of those pilots had a family. Parents who raised them, siblings who looked up to them, maybe girlfriends or young wives waiting at home. Each one represented years of life and potential and possibility. And they were thrown away for a military strategy that achieved almost nothing. The waste is staggering. Thousands of lives, hundreds of aircraft, barrels upon barrels of precious aviation fuel that Japan could not afford to spare, all for results that barely slowed the American advance at all. Even when a kamikaze did manage to hit a ship, the damage was not always decisive or even particularly significant. American warships, especially the larger ones like battleships and carriers, were built with extensive armor and compartmentalization. They had damage control parties that were drilled endlessly on how to fight fires and seal breaches and keep the ship operational. There are cases of American carriers taking multiple kamikaze hits and still being able to conduct flight operations within hours. The USS Bunker Hill, for example, was struck by 2 kamikazes in quick succession. The attacks killed nearly 400 men, which was absolutely terrible, and the damage was severe. But the carrier did not sink. The fires were brought under control. The ship made it back to port under its own power. Within a few months, it could have been repaired and sent back into service, although by that point the war was almost over anyway. The human dimension of the kamikaze program is where things get really dark. Western audiences tend to imagine these pilots as fanatic zealots who were eager to die for the emperor, but the reality was much more complicated and much sadder. Yes, there were certainly some true believers who genuinely thought they were performing a sacred duty. But there were also a lot of young men who were terrified and did not want to die, but felt they had no choice. The social pressure was enormous. Refusing a kamikaze mission would bring shame not just on yourself, but on your entire family. You would be branded a coward. Your loved ones would face consequences. Some pilots wrote letters that have survived, and when you read them, the fear and resignation are heartbreaking. They talk about hoping their planes will malfunction so they can turn back without losing face. They talk about being scared. They talk about wanting to see their families one more time. These were not mindless fanatics. These were ordinary young men who had been placed in an impossible situation by their government and their military and their culture. Some of them never even made it off the runway. Inexperience and poor training meant that crashes during takeoff were common. Imagine dying in a fireball on your own airfield before you even reach the ocean. Imagine that being your contribution to the war effort. The propaganda tried to paint these pilots as divine warriors, chosen by the gods, instruments of supernatural vengeance. But the truth was that they were boys flying obsolete machines against an enemy that had overwhelming technological and numerical superiority. One captured Japanese officer, when he was interviewed after the war ended, said something that really captures the futility of the whole thing. He said that Japan, by the end, did not have enough bombs or enough ships or enough men or enough of anything, really, so they decided to throw away the last resource they had left, which was their youth. They weaponized their own children in a last desperate gamble that never had any real chance of success. The irony of the whole kamikaze strategy is particularly bitter when you think about the economics of it. The original concept was that you would be trading something cheap, a basic fighter plane and a minimally trained pilot, for something expensive, a destroyer or cruiser or carrier that represented millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours of construction. But by 1945, planes were not cheap for Japan. Their industrial capacity was being destroyed by American bombing. Resources were critically short. Building a fighter, even a basic one, required aluminum and steel and rubber and electronics and fuel and factory time and transportation and 100 other things that Japan was running out of. Then you had to train the pilot, which required more fuel and instructor time and facilities. Then you had to transport the aircraft to an operational base and maintain it and fuel it for the mission. The total cost of each kamikaze attack, when you add up all the resources involved, was actually quite high. And what did each attack achieve? In the vast majority of cases, absolutely nothing. The plane and pilot would be lost without hitting anything. Even when hits were scored, the damage inflicted often cost less to repair than the kamikaze had cost to launch. The Japanese were literally bankrupting themselves to inflict pinprick damage on an enemy that had essentially unlimited industrial capacity. Every kamikaze mission was a net loss for Japan, not just in human terms, but in pure economic calculation. The divine wind was turning into a financial disaster as well as a human one. As the war went on and American sailors gained more experience with kamikaze attacks, the fear factor diminished significantly. Early on, there was definitely terror when these suicide planes appeared. The concept itself was frightening. A pilot who does not care about survival can take risks that nobody else would take. But after a few months of dealing with kamikazes, American crews realized that most of the attacks were ineffective. The defensive measures worked. The planes got shot down. Even when they got through, the ships usually survived. The kamikazes went from being this terrifying unknown to being just another tactical problem that had known solutions. Sailors still respected the courage it took for someone to deliberately fly to their own death, but they also recognized the futility of it. One American admiral summed it up pretty well when he said that they respected the bravery of the kamikaze pilots, but pitied how futile their sacrifice was. The bottom line, when you strip away all the mythology and propaganda and cultural baggage, is that kamikazes failed to achieve their strategic objectives. They did not stop the American advance. They did not prevent the invasion of Okinawa. They did not protect the Japanese home islands. They did not force the United States to reconsider their demands for unconditional surrender. They did not change the outcome of the war in any meaningful way. Almost every kamikaze mission ended in failure. Not because the pilots lacked courage, because obviously it takes immense courage to do what they did, but because courage alone cannot overcome mathematics and technology and industrial capacity. You cannot win a modern war through sheer willpower when your enemy has radar and proximity fuses and trained gunners and dozens of fighters in the air and hundreds of anti-aircraft guns on every ship and an industrial base that can replace losses faster than you can inflict them. Hollywood and popular culture like to portray kamikazes as these flaming arrows of doom, unstoppable harbingers of destruction that could appear out of nowhere and obliterate a warship in seconds. It makes for dramatic cinema. But the reality is so much sadder than that. The reality is thousands of young men, some of them barely old enough to be considered adults, being turned into human bombs by a government that had run out of options. The reality is inadequate training and obsolete equipment and a mission profile that had maybe a 10 or 15% chance of even hitting a target, let alone sinking it. The reality is families destroyed, potential wasted, lives thrown away for a cause that was already lost. When you dig into the actual historical records and the statistics and the accounts from both sides, what you find is not a story of heroic sacrifice turning the tide of battle. What you find is a story of desperate military leadership making terrible decisions and young men paying the price for those decisions with their lives. The kamikaze program was a symptom of how badly the war was going for Japan, not a solution to their problems. It was an admission that they could not win through conventional means, so they were resorting to suicide attacks as a last desperate measure. And even that did not work. The kamikaze phenomenon tells us something important about the nature of modern warfare. It tells us that individual acts of courage, no matter how extreme, cannot overcome fundamental disadvantages in resources and technology and training. It tells us that propaganda and mythology can convince people to sacrifice themselves, even when that sacrifice serves no real purpose. It tells us that military strategies born from desperation rarely succeed, because desperation is not a substitute for sound planning and adequate resources. Most of all, it tells us about the terrible human cost of war, about how young lives can be spent like currency by leaders who have run out of better options. Those 3,800 pilots who died in kamikaze attacks were not divine winds. They were not supernatural forces. They were human beings who deserved better than what their government gave them. They deserved to live full lives, to have families, to grow old, to contribute to society in ways that did not involve crashing explosively into enemy ships. Instead, they got a few weeks of flight training and a one-way ticket to oblivion, all in service of a strategy that accomplished almost nothing beyond adding to the already staggering death toll of the war. That is the real story of the kamikazes, and it is not the story you usually hear in movies or television shows or simplified historical accounts. But it is the truth, and the truth matters, even when it is uncomfortable and sad and completely at odds with the mythology.